Let me share my screen. Okay. I think we're there. Okay. Welcome to another episode of Macroeconomics Hours for June 8th, 2025. And the discussion topic for this session is U.S. federal debt and fiscal deficits. We've discussed this topic a number of other times, but the issue seems to be coming back in different ways, and it hasn't gone away anyway. So there are some new perspectives, new issues to discuss. We have a number of suggested readings, which you have probably received through LinkedIn message. Here I'm showing these, and this slide is going to be available to you after the session, so you can go and read the material in the links if you haven't looked at them already. This time, unlike other times, we also have a video. It's a conversation with a very prominent economist, Ken Rogoff, which is very interesting on inflation and the dollar and the debt of the United States government. So what I want to do for giving you some background before getting into details is to repeat, to some extent, this is going to be a repeat of a discussion we had about a year and a half ago about what happens to the debt, how and if debt goes up, what happens to the economy, to the financial markets, etc. So what I want to do is to discuss the possibility that there may be just two types of regimes. One is called the stable regime, or the a situation where the government can actually borrow more and more without consequences in terms of changes in interest rate. And then there's another regime, which is risky regime, which is the government is considered not creditworthy and not sufficiently creditworthy, so the lenders are hesitant to lend to the government. So in order to get to that discussion that these are two regimes that possibly U.S. government might be borrowing too much and moving towards from a safe regime to a risky regime, that is something to consider, that possibility. And you're going to see that the two situations are very different. And so far, government of the United States has been in a safe regime, meaning that it has borrowed without much consequence. But in terms of interest rates going up too much or creating too much high inflation, the government's borrowing and expenditure has had some impact on inflation, but it's very small amount. And while government debt has been going up very sharply. So I'm going to get to that in a moment to show you how the debt has increased and how deficits have contributed to that. So what happens if federal government does not pay back its debt? Well, certainly there's going to be chaos and possibly disaster. Financial markets are likely to collapse, starting with the bond market. Bond market, because if government doesn't pay back its debt, then nobody's going to provide new credit to the government, and the government will have difficulty carrying out the task that it's obligated to carry out. So the government is going to be in dire situation. And there are more graphic problems that may emerge in the economy, but I'm not going to get into the details of that. Just think about some chaos, collapse of markets, and also chaos in the rest of the economy. But this is very unlikely to happen because, especially in the case of countries that have their own currency, like the United States, and in particular the United States that has also the reserve currency of the world. The dollar is reserve currency for all other countries. There's going to be very little problem for the Fed to create more money and lend to the government. Buying government bonds means that the Fed is lending to the government so the government can pay back its debt to the public. So there's not going to be any default in that sense, but this is likely to create inflation, and if the situation is not properly managed, there's going to be a very high inflation, or maybe even it's maybe even hyperinflation. For example, in cases like Zimbabwe or Argentina, we've seen hyperinflation emerging from lack of trust in the government. So if the government if that happens and the central bank, in the case of the US, the Fed, creates more money in order to bail out the government, then it's going to be inflation, which is another form of debt repudiation. So here's the history of government debt in the federal government debt in terms of percentage GDP from late 1930s till now. And as you can see, there was the rise here during World War II. That jump in government debt to GDP ratio went away as prices started rising, GDP growing very fast, and government was not borrowing a whole lot. But since 1980, the trend has reversed, and you now have more debt than we've ever had before, even during World War II. And the deficit that has driven this debt is like this. There was a huge amount of borrowing. This curve, by the way, shows that this indicator shows the surplus of the United States government. Of course, if the surplus is negative, below the zero line, then that means large deficit. The scale here is on the left, the vertical axis, it's showing the surplus of the federal government. Now, after World War II, there was a period when the government was not running much of a deficit. And as the growth of GDP, increase in prices over time, gradually reduced the share of debt, public debt in GDP. But then starting 1970s, there have been periods of huge borrowing. And that is what has driven the GDP ratio ever since. Now, how does this possibility of government defaulting come about? Governments have essentially, there are four types of possible forms of borrowing constraint that the governments face. One is that there may be a limit imposed by the law. Let's call it this D, showing the limit, like the US government has a limit, upper limit or a ceiling, debt ceiling, that every time that they want to borrow more, the Congress should vote on it, which is very controversial. But that's a legal matter and that can be adjusted. There are also constraints that are imposed by the market. People will not lend to the government if they don't expect the government to have enough revenue, enough surpluses in the future. So certainly the debt of the government should not exceed the present value of expected budget surpluses in all future years. This limit, I call it D star. This is markets are very sensitive to this issue. But the one problem here is that expected budget surpluses, even though the expected value might be less than what the government wants to borrow, so the government in principle can pay back. One of the troubles is that every year the amount of surplus is a random variable. It could go up and down. And when there's a huge borrowing need, the government may actually not pay back its old debt. And that is a kind of the default that might happen, even if the government's in all future years, the government may be expected to get enough money to pay back its debt. But currently, if there's a huge need for expenditure, the government may suspend paying back its debt. And that means that lenders, creditors have to be careful when they lend to a government that may be subject to huge variations in its deficit or surplus. So that introduces a new ceiling, D double star, which is lower than D star, because lenders need to consider the maximum amount that they want to lend to the government, such that they don't face possibility of default in some future year. So larger debt levels bring the economy closer to, even if we consider D star as the ceiling, when the amount of debt that the government has gets close to that ceiling, then lenders become jittery. So because suddenly there may be a shock that pushes the government above that limit and the government defaults. But there's another layer that we also need to take into account. If there's a possibility that the government might default, then creditors will ask for a premium to compensate them for the risk. Because of that premium, interest rate that the government has to pay in that situation is going to be even bigger than the amount the government has to pay high interest, and therefore that has to be taken into account when creditors look at how much the government can borrow without much increasing the risk too much. And in fact, there's a limit of how much interest rate could go up, because if the interest rate goes up quite a bit, then the government will definitely default, because its debt could be building on itself and growing very fast. So this gives us another limit of how much the government can borrow based on the randomness of the future surpluses and also the risks that are going to be incorporated into the interest rate and make it more likely for the government debt to grow. So we seem to be at this stage right now in the US that possibly further government borrowing might lead to higher interest rates, and that puts the government in the whole country in a situation where there's debt market is not safe. So let me finish by just defining the safe debt versus risky debt regimes. In a safe debt regime, there's a huge distance between the current debt and this lowest debt rate, debt GDP ratio that I highlighted as the triple star. If the government is in this situation, then it can borrow easily. It basically looks like a situation where the government has access to indefinite or infinite amount of unlimited amount of credit at the current interest rate. But once the debt level goes up sufficiently and we get closer to the triple star, then interest rates start rising and kind of push the economy closer to that limit and make the default more likely. So this is the risky debt regimes. And essentially what is of concern here is whether the government has a large distance between its current debt and the ceiling defined as the triple star, or are we're getting close to that. We don't know exactly what the triple star is right now for the US because of in the past it has been borrowing and not much has happened. But we could be reaching that kind of closer to that level that then puts us in a different situation. For now, the debt regime in the US can be defined as safe debt regime, but we seem to be moving towards a risky debt regime, which could have major consequences for the world economy because there's not going to be any safe haven, which is the government bonds in the US trusted that they will be paid back. People may not think that the US government is going to be defaulting, but surely it's going to be very highly inflationary if the government has to avoid default by printing more money or forcing the Fed to buy more money, to create more money to bail out the government. Okay, so I hope I have clarified that the difference between these two regimes and the danger that we're facing, that we might transit from safe debt regime to a risky debt regime, which is going to be making the US look more like a developing country with risky debt. All right, that's all I wanted to say, and thanks for listening. Now I stop sharing, so
Thank you, Hadi.
Take over.
Hadi, just one quick question. So, sort of when you shared the statistics on U.S. government debt as percentage of GDP, so United States is currently somewhere around 120%, right? Sort of, which actually it has been a little bit higher during the COVID times, right? And sort of then it went down a bit, then it went up a bit. But some of it, I would assume, is related to, temporary drops in GDP itself during the COVID era, right? And so then the debt kind of starts looking higher as percentage of GDP. So some of that percentage, so something to keep in mind for us. But, sort of one question is that there are other countries, there are a few other countries that have higher debt as percentage of GDP.
Like Japan, for example.
Japan, right? And Japan is currently somewhere around 200%, or is it higher than 200% now?
250%.
250%. So it's quite a bit higher, right? So is there?
But that's what I've heard, because it depends on what you include as government debt and what is kind of considered hidden debt. Mm-hmm. So I guess we could later on talk about hidden debt of governments.
Okay, all right, sounds good. But United States basically is not necessarily terribly unusual, and there are still other countries that have higher debt burdens as percentage of GDP. But of course, the devil is in the detail for those things.
Exactly.
Okay, all right, very good. Well, let me go into my presentation. And so, folks, there's probably going to be a little bit of overlap between what Hadi talked about and what I will talk about. And I'll also share a few things that we've already shared in our session in September of last year, right? But from those items, there is just sort of a few things that I wanted to restate, right? I want to talk a little bit more about, I want to remind you what the original policy proposals were of President Trump when he was a candidate for election, right? I'll just run a few quick definitions related to the budget lingo that they use here. and I'll reproduce a slide where we talked about the Penn-Wharton budget model. And Penn-Wharton budget model, basically Penn-Wharton site is like, it's one of my favorite resources. So they do fairly good assessments of various policies. So if you have a chance to subscribe and keep an eye on that, that might be a good idea for kind of like the general informational level that you want to maintain, right? But let me present back some of those key policy proposals. So when President Trump was running for office, so promises that he made included extending the individual income tax provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2017. And so there might be a little bit of confusion here in terms of the name of the bill, but this is also the bill that President Trump originally called the Big Beautiful Bill, right? So essentially the new Big Beautiful Bill, they call it the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025 that is in Congress right now, right? President Trump also promised to eliminate taxes on Social Security benefits from the business side. He wanted to extend the business tax cut provisions, sort of which included, sort of both lower interest rates on corporate income. And he even proposed rolling it down to 15%, right? And sort of other provisions such as various treatments of investment, research and development, interest deduction, so on and so forth, right? Okay, so this is what was promised. In terms of the linguistics that we use, our budget lingo, keep in mind that when we talk about budget deficit, it's basically your revenue minus your spending as far as government is concerned, right? And revenues is what the governments collect in taxes, minus potentially tax transfers, right? But we also subtract spending from there, and spending on and the federal government spends quite a bit of money, and so that has to be accounted for that. So when we talk about primary budget deficit, it's basically the same as budget deficit, but we exclude interest payments, right? Because the idea is that there is a little bit less control over interest payments themselves. So if you look at the primary budget deficit, from many perspectives, that might be a more effective measure of how they're spending money. When we analyze the impact of various policy proposals and tax bills, we have to engage in both static or conventional analysis. So we're looking at what the changes in revenues and spending are that are associated with those policies. But also, if you want to look at it on a dynamic basis, you have to take into account the idea that those tax policies, spending policies, will also impact economic activity. And so you basically take that impact on economic activity, on people's behavior, and incorporate those changes into calculations to make them more precise to account for such changes, right? And so back in 2024, the analysis of the Penn-Wharton model of President Trump's projected impact if he is elected looked like something like this, right? And generally speaking, what you're seeing here in this bottom line is the initially impact, a negative sign in here. Remember, this basically increases the deficit, right? And so you can see that all of those numbers are negative, and they sum up to a pretty large number right here, right? So generally speaking, the policies were expected to increase the primary deficit throughout time. And so let's, for the next 10 years, basically, and so let's take a look at what is going on right now. Okay, so there are a couple of things happening in 2025. First of all, now some of those promises are getting converted into actual policy. And so we're looking at the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025, right? Sort of this is a budgetary act, essentially. But there's also increased pressure that is taking place because the interest rates remain relatively high, and debt servicing of the federal debt is becoming more and more expensive, right? And so all of those things essentially are starting to contribute to what a lot of economists are seeing as a relatively quick transition from a safe debt regime and into a riskier debt regime. And so our job here today is going to look at this in a little more depth, maybe share our own predictions, even though predicting things in economics is probably a very unthankful business, but we are also very interested in learning what your own thoughts on those things are. Okay. So if we go to this One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025. So as promised by the president, it makes the TCJA tax cuts permanent, right? Sort of these were individual and corporate tax cut reductions. They were made for a period of 10 years because of the budget balancing requirements that exist. But now the idea is that we want to the party in power wants to make them permanent, right? So in terms of the tax policy changes, so there is a few things that were not initially promised, like exempting income from tips and overtime pay from income taxes. And by the way, things that I'm putting here in red and green, so this is not a value judgment on my side. Basically, if you're saying something here in red, it means it will have a negative impact on the budget surplus, right? Sort of it will increase deficit. If you see something in green, it means that it contributes to reducing the deficit or potentially increasing the surplus, right? And so another item that is a part of the new bill is the increase in the SOL deduction cap from $10,000 to $40,000. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, SOL stands for the state and local taxes. And the idea is that if you actually haven't seen this money come to you in disposable pay because a portion of your paycheck had been withheld by the local government agencies, and this would be things like the state income taxes. This would be things like the state real estate taxes, property taxes, and things like that. So the taxpayer essentially should be able to deduct them, right, from their tax bases, essentially. And back in 2017, this deduction had been limited to only $10,000. And so there is a bit of a political economy here in this decision, or there was a bit of a political economy in this decision that meant that states that typically voted conservative are usually the states that lower local taxes, states like Texas, states like Florida, states that may not even have an income, sort of a state income tax on them, right? And so essentially the burden of that SOLT deduction cap primarily fell on individuals, on relatively rich individuals from relatively high tax states, which tend to vote Democratic. So these are states like New Jersey, Illinois, and Illinois, if I remember correctly, might be the #1 state in terms of its overall tax burden. States like California, right? So this was something that was done essentially to reward folks from the more conservative states, right? In some ways. So another policy change is actually raising the child tax credit from $2,000 to $2,500, right? Oh, and by the way, so one of the reasons I presume why there is a proposal to increase the SOL deduction cap is to bring some of those states that might be on the cusp of, sort of representatives might be on cusp of voting or not voting from the policy. You're trying to get some sort of an agreement for this bill, right? Sort of that's basically a way to folks from those richer states. So all three of those things basically increase the deficit. There are also some things that actually contribute to reducing the deficit are things like taxes on university endowments. And generally speaking, this is probably not going to be very much. That's not going to bring very much to the budget, but I'm highlighting that in green still. There is additional taxes proposed to remittances abroad. So when you send the money to somebody else, that money might be taxed, and it's typically not taxed right now. It also eliminates clean energy and EV tax credits, right? So in terms of other government spending issues that we are seeing in this bill is, there are significant spending cuts across multiple departments, right? And so and we'll go through what they are, sort of in the next slide, but that contributes to reducing the deficit. There is more stringent requirements for social safety net programs, things like food stamps, right? Like SNAP benefits. things like healthcare programs that are run by the states for the federal government, right? Sort of, it will be more difficult to use those services, and eligibility might be restricted for a lot of them. But there is also an increase in defense and border enforcement spending. So, and more spending here obviously contributes to higher deficits too. And so if you look, if you assess what this does, and again, I'm using the Penn-Wharton budget model in here. So this is the rough analysis in here in terms of what it does to primary deficit, right? And so keep in mind that, sort of the signs here, it's a little different from the previous graph that I've shown you. If you're seeing here a negative sign, that means the primary deficit is reduced. If you're seeing a positive number, that means that the primary deficit is increased, and that's a bad thing, obviously, right? Sort of, that's not something that I want to see. And so where are the majority of those changes taking place? Well, if you look at the numbers, there is a lot of pretty large numbers in the Ways and Means from the Ways and Means Committee, which is your income taxes from individuals and from corporations. And so the impact here is basically making those income tax cuts from 2017 to be permanent. They were scheduled to revert back to their original level in 2026 and beyond. So this now reflects their permanence. What we are also seeing is that there is significant decrease in spending in the agriculture, right? And so these are essentially your SNAP benefits or your food stamps benefits, right? In terms of education and workforce, we are also seeing quite a bit here too. So these actions reduce deficit, but that's basically student loans that's reflected in here. And then in the energy and commerce, sorry, I meant to say that this is not student loans, but these are the energy credits. This is health insurance. I'm gonna amend this note in here, so I apologize for that. But this is where those changes come from, and obviously total changes are pretty significant, right? And generally speaking, if you look at the impact of those changes, they're very comparable to the original predictions that were made based on what was known about the then candidate Trump's policy platform, right? This basically means that we're not helping budget deficits very much here, right? With this bill, we're making them quite a bit worse. But one argument that you could make is to say, oh, but wait, one of the promises being made, and this is a somewhat uncertain promise, is that, look, all of those things don't matter all that much because they're measured in a static way. If you take into account the idea that all of those big, beautiful things that we are doing are also going to increase economic growth and help people work more, all of those things will mean that the true impact on the budget is going to be quite a bit lower, right? Sort of the deficit is not going to increase this much. There are some people who claim that the deficit is actually going to increase. Well, let's take a look at about what the Penn-Wharton model actually says about that. And if you move from conventional analysis and into dynamic analysis, doesn't look all that different to me, actually. It looks like it's getting worse, right? Sort of you're seeing that the total the total impact is a significant cumulative increase in budget deficits and therefore in debt as well, right? Question is, why is that the case? There is a couple of explanations here. So explanation number one is that, if you're thinking about folks who are in danger of losing eligibility for some of the programs like Medicaid, basically the response to that might be to reduce hours worked rather than to increase hours worked, which might be impossible. So this means that this is actually lower economic activity. There might be a bit of a positive impact in here in terms of economic activity. And so again, treat this, sort of as just pure impact on the budget deficits, right? So lower wage workers in general, who might be more concerned about their social safety net, some of them might increase hours worked. So that will contribute positively to economic growth. But at the very same time, if you look at higher wage workers, um, and this is due to something that is called an income effect, right? So the idea in here is that let's say that your income increases because of lower taxes, right? The question is, does that create an incentive for you to work more, or does it create an incentive for you to work less? You might say, well, it might create an incentive for me to work more because I'm basically making more money per hour, if you will, right? So there is a better incentive for me to put a few more hours of work. But at the very same time, because your overall income increases, it also means that you might make a decision to actually reduce the hours that you work, because those, sort of if you're working 50-hour weeks, right? Those last few hours that you work, they contribute quite a bit to your dissatisfaction with your work, right? And they will say, look, I'm making actually a little bit more money given the lower taxes, right? So I can afford to work maybe 45 hours instead of 50, right? And so something like that would lead to the income effect of reducing the hours that you work. And so generally speaking, when you take all of those things into account, what this budget model expects to happen is that overall there is going to be an increase in the hours worked. But this increase is likely going to come from lower income workers actually working more. Higher income workers will likely work less precisely because of the income effect that we described. And then as a result, even though overall hours worked across the country increase, your budget receipts are going to go down because folks of lower income pay relatively lower taxes, right? We live in sort of the income tax system is progressive. The higher is your income, the higher is the percentage on every marginal dollar that you work. And so in this case, overall budget receipts are are expected to actually go down a little bit because of those effects in the dynamic environment. So let me do this. Let me just pause for a moment and stop sharing, and let me ask if there is any questions so far about things that I've talked about. And folks, please, don't hesitate to speak up. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand. So any questions or comments so far? Marcy, go ahead.
On what we just discussed, it looks like a lot of the assumptions are based on hourly wages or hourly hours worked.
Uh-huh.
Like, for example, higher wage earners are typically salaried individuals. And so if they work less or more, it wouldn't really impact that. Is that correct?
I mean, just to some extent that might be true, right? But generally speaking, so a lot of that activity comes from folks that are not necessarily salaried, that might be business owners. So there might be a pretty straight, there might be a pretty, there might be a very strong correlation between hours worked and your compensation, right? If you're running your own business, generally the idea is that if you're putting more hours into your business, you expect to actually get back a little bit more in terms of overall compensation, correct?
Okay. And then following up on that too, I feel like there's a lot of assumptions here where there has to be an availability of jobs for people to work more.
Mhm.
And like with mass or higher rates of unemployment currently, like there might not be jobs for people to even work more if they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, sure, there is a good amount of assumptions, but what I want to say is that sort of the model that we were talking about is an extremely complex model. It's been judged to be fairly accurate in its predictions, and sort of the model obviously gets updated based on the accuracy of those predictions, right? So overall, while I'm not dismissing your concern at all, I tend to think that these predictions are likely going to be pretty consistent with what we can expect to see, right?
Okay.
Provided that nothing else changes. So I have actually a pretty good amount of trust into the Penn board model. It tends to be
Hmm.
pretty high quality. It tends to be driven by the data with the feedback to past experiences. And so it generates pretty reliable results.
Okay, and then one final question. Is there
Uh-huh.
any impact for like AI or automation in the workforce and how that might impact just individuals getting jobs?
Sure. But sort of I think the idea in here is that a lot of those things are still somewhat unclear, right?
Okay.
And so what we're looking here, it's just the marginal change that is associated with specific policy changes, right? So there, of course, may be other changes, which is absolutely true. But here we're not talking about the absolute levels of performance, rather what the policy might add to or subtract from that budget performance that we can expect to see.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, very good. All right, Carmen, did you have another question? Go ahead, if you can voice it out.
Sure. Thank you for your invitation,
Of
Professor
course.
Vlad. Uh, there are these big tech companies, and one is Microsoft. That from the beginning of the year, it's continuous announcing that they are reducing the number of employees, and not only Microsoft. How this action is going to impact the calculation? Because if less employees, all these employees, they are quite high income earners, so less taxes to collect, most probably, for the
I
government.
mean, I think that's true, but again, keep in mind that Microsoft, even though it's a relatively large company, it's probably very small compared to the rest of the population and the rest of the business activity, right? So there is a lot of sort of announcements and news that we see that they'll say, "Oh, this company laid off whatever 8,000 people or something like that." But sort of in the grand scheme of things, this 8,000 people probably or 10,000 people, this is a very small, very tiny percentage of population. And again, I'm not trying to discount any of this, but sort of I'd be, sort of sort of those anecdotal sort of announcements. They may be very different from what you expect to see in the rest of the war, sort of in the rest of the economy. And again, come back to the idea that this only shows the marginal impact of those changes in policy, right? Sort of all of the other things are kind of like keeping them aside, but we're saying, well, if you add this policy, this is what we expect the impact of just this policy change is going to be.
Mhm. Okay,
All right,
thank you very much.
all right, very good. Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yeah. So if the deficit is being paid by the securities, right, like treasury bill or like bonds?
Sorry, what's the question?
No, like if the like Jamie Dimon is saying like the bond market is going to crack down
Uh-huh.
because of the deficit, and
Mm-hmm.
if the securities like the bonds and bills are being going down,
Mm-hmm.
how will the government's balance this deficit if Jerome Powell is not going to print money?
Mhm. Well,
So how will
Jerome Powell doesn't print money per se, right? Sort of keep in mind that, sort of United States monetary policy just doesn't involve printing money to finance government deficits, right? So the relationship here is a little bit more complex, and Hadi talked a bit about that when he talked about the safe versus risky regime, right? So when the United States government runs deficits and Treasury has to borrow money, sure, some of this borrowing comes from, sort of some of this borrowing basically is consumed by the Fed, right? Because United States Treasury issues bonds. The Fed will create money to purchase those bonds, but it's not just printing money. It's not just creating money, right? Eventually, when the Fed redeems this bond and doesn't roll it over, money is also going to be destroyed as well. So the impact on things like inflation should not be there.
thank you.
Uh-huh.
Please,
And
But I'll talk in a second. I'll talk in a second about some of the cracks in the bond market. So because you're raising a really important issue, right? And we want to take a look at what is happening in those bond markets and what is happening to the perception of the United States government debt being one of the safest instruments out there. And Hadi, I apologize, I interrupted you. You wanted to add something?
Just wanted to say that what Jamie Dimon seems to be saying is that because the way the government of the US is behaving and the expected deficits going up, creditors are increasing the premium that they're asking for their money. And that is basically the factor that maybe is undermining the bond markets. Interest rates going up because of increased risk, and then that means that the government will have to pay a lot more interest, and that makes the situation even worse.
That's
So
right. That creates a vicious cycle, right?
Vicious cycle, exactly. That makes the debt go up much faster.
Okay. All right. Excellent. All right, folks. Anything else? Any other comments so far before I go back to the presentation?
One, yeah, one unrelated to this question, so maybe I can ask at the end of.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, let me share my screen. Let me go to the rest what I have. So I'll just show you a few more charts that show to you the sense of what the United States primary budget balance looks like. And remember, primary budget balance actually excludes the interest costs, right? Sort of the costs of servicing the debt to US government. And you can see that one of the challenges that we're observing, and so this is a very, very long time frame, right? This is basically more than 2 centuries of data in here. And you can see that, so somewhere here, this is the last time that we're running some primary budget surpluses. And so starting here, so starting somewhere around, sort of around 2000s, right? Sort of in 2000s, what we're seeing is, sort of those, so I mean, some of this is, sort of this is we are seeing, like the impact of the balanced budget, so budgets that run surpluses during the Bill Clinton era, right? So even though we've run budget deficits ever since, in some of the years, you might actually see a positive primary budget balance. So you may be running deficit per se, but once you exclude deficit payments, it actually might be somewhat positive, right? But that had been much more of an exception rather than the rule. So in the last roughly 20 years, what we are seeing is very, very significant primary budget deficits, right? And those deficits reach some very high numbers, right? And they're almost comparable to what we've seen during the Second World War II right here, and during the First World War II. They haven't gotten as high as percentage of GDP, but they're extremely significant. And this is actually one of the big concerns because, typical macroeconomic, sort of typical policy theory goes is that, well, if you look at the government, the idea is to run a counter-cyclical balance, which means that you spend more and you run deficits during bad financial times, right? When the economy is in a recession. Doing so helps you to stimulate aggregate demand and helps you to bring the economic growth to where it should be. But during the good economic times, especially during the times when the economy is overheated, you basically should be spending less money than what you're earning in tax receipts. And you should be ideally using some of this money to retire the current debt, right? And so if I go from this chart back to the chart that Hadi already shared with you, if you're looking at the federal surplus or deficit, obviously deficit is what is below zero, right? As percentage of gross domestic budget, you're seeing some pretty concerning numbers here during Second World War II, as you would expect to see. But when we look at everything here, you're seeing a continuing deficit, right? And that trend, if you actually draw a trend line through here, it keeps essentially getting worse and worse. So a few other numbers is that we are seeing that because interest rates have risen in the past few years, what we are seeing is that the United States government is spending more and more on the cost of servicing those debts. And right now, as of 2020, fiscal year 2025, The interest costs are the second category in the budget, just below the social security spending, and higher than Medicare, higher than national defense, higher than social welfare programs, higher than Medicaid and veterans benefits and services. So it is a significant issue. And if you look at the projections that are shown right here, those projections are showing continuing increases in the net interest costs. Given those things, I think the reasonable question to ask is the United States starting to run out of fiscal space? And the idea of fiscal space, it's basically the idea is that you're able to borrow money freely in the financial markets, that the financial markets consider to you as highly likely to repay their debt. And so when you need money, when you hit bad economic times, you're able to borrow it quite freely. Well, those cracks are starting to appear in this idea of fiscal space being enjoyed by the United States government. First of all, we are seeing interest rates on government bonds increasing. This is not necessarily just an issue of the United States, but it's also an issue across the world. If you look at those graphs, and those graphs basically show percentage point change since January 1st of 2025. So in the last couple of months, those have increased for the great majority of the countries, including the United States, including Japan, Britain, and Germany. You might actually make an argument that Germany is here for the good reasons, because Germany recently announced that it's expecting to spend more money on things like infrastructure. And it's been criticized for a very long time of not essentially spending enough on infrastructure because of a unique provision in German constitution known as the debt break, which essentially says that you cannot borrow money unless it's borrowed for very specific purposes that increase infrastructure. But Germans have been extremely thrifty with spending their money, and so because of that, when Germany announced in the last couple of months that it will be spending and did more money on things like defense and infrastructure, market celebrated, but the interest rates on government bonds actually increased. But that more reflects an expectation of higher economic growth, right? And so if we expect economic growth to be higher in the future, that means that we expect the central bank of the country to pursue a contractionary monetary policy, which means that the interest rates will be higher. And so those expectations for higher growth basically get priced into increasing rates on government bonds. So Germany is a bit of an exception in here in terms of showing up in this chart for good reasons, right? For the reasons of increased economic growth expectations. The rest of the world, not so much. We're also seeing in the United States significant public disagreements between key political figures. And I don't know about you, but I've watched like the last couple of days. It was an interesting show, right? To follow, sort of what is going on X.com, to look at the news and that the statements are made, right? And it seems that it's kind of hard to figure out what the true disagreement between Mr. Musk and Mr. Trump might be, right? But I think kind of like the idea that, here we have the Department of Government Efficiency that identified savings somewhere equal to, sort of $150 billion. And that's a really, really big deal, right? But at the very same time here, we have a budget bill that basically increases the deficits by a lot more than that, right? Sort of that 150 billion is just a fraction of those increased deficits that we're seeing. What we've seen in the past few months is the credit rating agencies downgraded US debt. And I think the last one of them literally downgraded the debt in May, if I recall correctly, right? So United States sovereign debt no longer enjoys the highest ratings at those agencies, but it's just one step down compared to them. And part of the reason that those agencies have cited are the concerns, and this is a quote, about effectiveness, stability, and predictability of American policymaking and political institution. And the idea is that those things, they're not effective, if they're not stable, and they're not predictable. Markets hate uncertainty, right? Even if things work out in the future, the uncertainty and the inability to plan is what negatively impacting the markets right now. And so the question remains, what would a benevolent dictator do, right? Sort of this is the question in my mind. What would you do if you were in charge of that policy? Are there better ways of managing our debt? What should we be concentrated on? And it seems like the political parties in the United States so far are not offering a terribly good answer to this question. And let me ask this of the rest of you, including Hadi, of course. What would you do in this case if you were in charge of those policies? What would you do differently? All right, anyone? Hadi, I know it might be a little unfair to put you in the spotlight, but what would you suggest if you were, if you were advising government officials on the actions to be taken? What might your advice be? And Hadi, you're on mute if you were talking.
I think probably the best thing to do is to avoid tax cuts at this point and consider some tax increases in order to reduce the deficit and some cutting government expenditure. But the question is which items, and that's a political question. Which items, in my view, any benefit that the government is providing to people, high-income people, should be looked at first. Rather than cutting Medicaid, I would rather see a cut in the deductions that the rich get.
All right, and so is it fair to say that sort of when they look at the deficit problem, it's not so much the problem of spending, even though the problem of spending is there. It's much more of a problem of government revenue. Would that be a correct statement, Hadi?
Yes and no. There are some areas of increasing government expenditure, which, at least to my taste, is not that needed. But in terms of shortage of revenue, the fact that the government is not generating enough revenue, I think that's a key fact. So I agree.
Okay. All right. Great, folks. The rest of you in this session, what would you do? What do you think United States government should be doing, and sort of what kind of political promises would resonate with you as voters? What's your take?
My take would be, sorry. Can I?
Anil, why don't you go ahead and we'll go to somebody else after you.
Sure. Yeah, my take would be like get rid of the uncertainty in the market. When the uncertainty is there, the companies or the any investments, FDI or any of the investments won't be happening. And much of the current situation is either due to the tariffs on again, off again, 50% on aluminum and steel, 25%, 50%. It's like there's a lot of this all over the board. That's the uncertainty is what is one of the primary reason what I would think is to get it off at the moment.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is getting rid of the uncertainty in policymaking, have a more stable, more predictable policy, including essentially in the use of tariffs, right? So that the companies are able to plan their economic activity better, and so that they do not constrain their decisions and don't reduce economic activity because of uncertainty. Excellent. Other folks, what's your take?
I think I can go next. So I think I agree with Anil says. Basically, we definitely need more certainty. So government should be able to make the fast and effective decision making and stick with that for a little bit longer. And then not only that, I feel like the inequality gap between wealthy and the normal people is increasing. That should be like everyone should be fairly taxed. Wealthy should be fairly taxed. The normal people should be fairly taxed. And I feel like the basic needs, for example, the the fair housing, the Medicare, and everything. Those should definitely be provided. Those should not be eliminated. And the citizens should be encouraged in such a way so they are actually willing to reskill themselves in the maybe because of the technology advancement and everything, people are feeling like there are not more jobs and everything. That is creating another kind of chaos. So everyone, government should be spending more into reskilling the people. So all these kind of uncertainty about the jobs and everything get out of the way.
Okay, all right, great. But sort of what I'm hearing also is sort of the idea that the tax system, while fairness is very much a normative question, right? And sort of we often stick to positive questions in economics. The idea is that we could increase the tax revenue by taking away some of those reductions in marginal tax rates for very high income people. Okay, great, excellent.
Right.
Folks,
And
anybody
I
else?
still don't. I'm
Go
not
ahead.
confident about what's happening with the EV tax cuts and everything. I
Mhm.
feel like we are going backward, encouraging the fossil fuel versus the energy efficient program. So this is basically not going to be environmentally sustainable in the longer run. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you for sharing. How about the rest of you folks? Any comments from anybody else?
Vivian is asking for predictions.
Predictions. So Hadi, predictions are, famously unthankful business in economics, right? Sort of, but what are your predictions here? What do you think is going to happen?
I still remain optimistic that Trump will have come to his senses and avoid this kind of chaos that he's created in the economy down the road. When he sees that the economy is not doing very well, as a result, inflation goes up and GDP even may decline, real GDP may decline 6 months or so when a lot of these policies get implemented. And also around the world, it doesn't get much, he won't be able to do a whole lot of generating revenue through tariffs, etc. And tariffs also distort markets. He might actually back off a little bit and focus on stability rather than on doing extraordinary things.
All right. Yeah.
One more point I would like to add is around, like, I think there is lack of planning in terms of execution. There is like policies being changed back and forth. I think like looking into implications of and the execution aspects, I think is important as well. And I'm also thinking like I know we talked a lot about how we can decrease the deficit, but I think like how we can increase GDP may be another aspect to think about from a government perspective.
Yeah.
Good point.
Excellent point.
So along the same lines, Lad and Professor, I know the comparison between what was said during campaign and what has happened in 6 months would have been historically researched for many presidents before. We've also highlighted the gaps since World War II or even before and how it has been. So looking at the history and the deviation, how mainly there are multiple topics. Only looking at the financial aspects of it, how big is the gap now? Can you give some perspective?
Yeah, my sense is that this gap is pretty considerable, right? So the idea is that we are running deficits that are equivalent to something like 7% of a GDP during peacetime, right? That's extremely unusual, right? During the war times, sure, this is sort of you expect the countries to run deficits, right? If you look at the deficits that Ukraine is running right now in this conflict, in the armed conflict with Russia, those deficits are much more significant, of course, than what the United States has experienced. But I think the idea, sort of the idea of fiscal responsibility and the idea of running balanced budgets one of the articles that I've shared with you in the suggested readings for today's sessions is that we've had a number of people, a number of high-level policy people, a number of economists coming up and saying, look, sort of what we have here is unsustainable, right? But that's been going on for good 20 years, for good 30 years, potentially, maybe even more than that, right? And yet it looks that debt gets bigger and bigger, right? It looks like the deficits are continuously being run. And that's, generally speaking, that's not a sustainable place to be at. We have to get used to, potentially consuming a little bit less, to to potentially having higher, sort of higher tax burden. I think not maybe necessarily for everybody in the population, but there's probably a significant percentage of population whose tax burden is relatively low, right? I think a lot of it came to light even during during the presidential elections, right? If you look, for example, at President Trump's tax returns and the percentage and the amount of taxes that he has paid. It has happened, I think, with Mitt Romney during Romney's presidential campaign, when I think it was a little bit shocking for a lot of people to figure out that his secretary was paying a higher effective tax rate than what he was paying, because the tax system as it exists right now is fairly biased towards certain types of incomes being taxed at a relatively higher rate and contributing to lower effective tax rates. And generally speaking, sort of the push that they had for, for more than a decade, right, in terms of reducing the taxes and constraining the growth of the federal government, contributed to significant shortages in U.S. government budget revenue. So that remains a very important consideration.
So contributed to inequality.
Yeah. And so we tend to avoid very often those normative questions about how things should be. But inequality had been growing, right? And there is no way to avoid inequality. And I would argue that we probably wouldn't want to avoid inequality anyway, because as the example of the Soviet Union had shown, when everybody is equal, then nobody is equal, really, right? But the high level of inequality and the high level of probably contributes quite a bit to political polarization, and that can contribute to significant conflicts taking place in a society that would not even be envisioned a few years ago. And those things can happen very quickly.
So is it right to say the gap has been the highest in peacetime?
I think during the peacetime, yeah. So we are during the period where the gap had been extremely, extremely high, right? It simply, in my opinion, shouldn't be the case when they're running those extremely significant deficits, whether you look at the primary budget deficit or the overall budget deficit with the interest costs incorporated in that. But it's not reasonable to run those gaps for so many years and so consistently.
I think the deficit has increased not because of one person, but over time by many others before.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's an issue of political economy, right? Because generally speaking, sort of we went away from the system where politicians were rewarded for taking fiscally conservative actions, right? But because of, sort of a number of things about, the political system itself, right? The way how people vote, the short-term behavior, taking decisions that would potentially reduce deficits tends to be politically costly for people. And that's one of the reasons why they don't make such decisions, right? So I keep hearing about this proposal that's been around for a while. It's, sort of not, it hasn't been a terribly serious proposal, but the idea is that, well, then Congress is in charge of the purse, right? And so if we're running budget deficits, members of the Congress should not be eligible for election. So we've seen kind of like that idea come up every so often in conversation. I know that there have been at least 3 people who said, "Oh, if you only had that, that would have been great." And while sort of I personally view that as relatively simplistic, because there are times when you should be running deficits. You should be following counter-cyclical fiscal policy, right? So deficits are a valuable tool in managing the economy, but what is not valuable is running those deficits year after year after year. If you continue on that path will eventually become unsustainable. All right, folks. Go ahead,
Just wanted
Hadi,
to say
sorry.
that one of the problems is that in the old days, Republicans played a key role in keeping the deficit down. But ever since Reagan administration 40 years ago, 40, more than 40 years ago, they have started competing in terms of who can spend more and tax less. And therefore, the deficit has been a political tool. But even though everybody understands that that should be reduced, but in practice, they want to spend more and tax less in order to get votes.
And we've seen good examples of parties coming together, right? On issues like this, like when Bill Clinton was elected, right? It was fantastic to see, more unity on the issue of fiscal responsibility among the two parties. In many ways, Bill Clinton had, we've thought that he had remade the Democratic Party, but obviously not so much, right?
But the moment Bush administration started, right after Clinton administration, they started spending more and taxing less. And so that, I think that encouraged Biden in the past 4 years to sponsor a lot of expenditure and contribute to the deficit and possibly to inflation quite a bit.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and now I can ask that question that I wanted to ask you before. Yeah, it's relevant to what we're talking about, like the budgets and deficits. So now we have this, the universities. So what are the universities going to do? Specifically, it is banking on international students coming into it. The endowments that are given to the universities aren't supposed to be utilized, are supposed to be utilized for the intended purpose that donors have given. Are universities going to increase the tuition fees for students because the international students aren't going to come to the United States and study at US universities? What's that? How is our universities gearing up to balance the deficit creation?
Oh, that's an excellent question, right? It's more of a microeconomic question, or at least it kind of intersects both micro and macro topics, but it's going to be interesting to see that. Just one thing, a couple of things I wanted to mention before I let Hadi talk about some of those things, is that the issue of endowments and taxation of the university endowments, it's really not a systemic issue. It's not a systemic issue. There are very few very rich universities in the United States that have significant endowments and then depend significantly on the income from those endowments. It's generally speaking not a concern for most institutions. Even take University of Illinois. University of Illinois is a state institution. It doesn't have a much of an endowment to speak with, right? There is some money, sort of in the foundation, some money in the endowment for restricted things, but it's not all that big, right? Sort of where University of Illinois suffers a lot more than the endowment tax. It's the other policies, for example, the ones that cut down the federal funding and the overhead in federal funding, right? This is what we are suffering from in here. And so how might universities respond to something like this? Well, ability to raise prices is constrained by student demand, right? And my argument here would be is that the way how student demand looks like right now, is that there is simply not enough room for universities to continue increasing their prices because the demand simply isn't there. The demand had become reasonable, very elastic at the portion where universities operated in. Because for many, many years, for 30, 40 years or so, universities dealt with their issues very easily because every year they would raise tuition by roughly 5%. I think the average rate of tuition growth since 1980s had been around 5% or more than twice the rate of economic growth in general. That is in the universities simply no longer. So what we can expect to see, I suspect, in universities is there's going to be more consolidation. There's going to be probably reductions of programs. There's going to be ways for looking how to do things more efficiently. For example, like getting the faculty in the IMBA program, potentially use artificial intelligence, generative AI for grading more, and using teaching assistants less for something like that. But there is no question in my mind that over the next 10, 15 years, there's going to be a lot of adjustments in the higher education system. There will be a number of universities and campuses that will close, similar to what is happening in Pennsylvania, for example, where there is a proposal, I think, to shut down 4 universities that are part of the state university system, right? But hopefully there's probably not going to be more increases in tuition just because the market isn't going to be able to bear it. So that's my 2 cents. That's my prediction here. Hadi, what do you think?
I also think that the demand from domestic students for higher education has gone down, and that constrains universities. Even worse, foreign students may come much less to the US, given current policies. So that could impact universities, especially U of I, for example, or top universities as well. Foreign students are going to be a lot less, coming less, and that has been a source of increasing revenue for state universities, state-owned universities like U of I. So it's the prospect doesn't look too good for universities.
On the other hand, I think there is a little bit of a silver lining in here too. I think there are some schools who do really well in terms of providing affordable yet high quality education. I'd like to think that the IMBA program and the iDegree program that GIS College of Business offers are a good example of something like that. Because to earn, a master's degree and a full-blown MBA degree of 70 credits rather than an MBA Light, and to do so for under $30,000, this is unheard of, right? This is an extremely good price. University of Illinois GIS College of Business has figured out how to attract the students and how to price their programs correctly, and how to build a system where you can actually even make a little bit of money, right? Because the program is running a surplus. Purdue University, I think, is excellent. Sort of has been excellent in doing something like this, and then keeping the cost of undergraduate education under $10,000 for many, many years. And I think in some ways this might spur institutions towards competition on figuring out how to deliver high quality program, yet how to find ways to control costs better and to provide a better experience for their students and for their faculty. So they'll have to see how this works out. We're lucky in a sense that we are a perfect laboratory for innovation in higher education in the United States. 50 states have different regulatory environments with different university systems, so a significant number of private institutions in addition to state colleges. So I have I do believe that we'll figure it out, and that the higher education system will be stronger than it used to be.
Thanks, Brad. And you just gave me a good idea for my startup idea on grading system with AI. Thanks.
Excellent. We'll have to check in with you later and ask for royalties, right?
Yes. Thanks, Brad.
All right, excellent. All right, folks, I think it's about 2:20. Oh, I didn't realize we were running late. I'm so sorry. So we had a great discussion. So thanks for joining us. I'll post the recording on the YouTube channel, and I'll post the slides as well. And if you have any ideas for future sessions, please let us know.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.